All right, so welcome back. The last lecture we were working on inbreeding and inbreeding depression. Today, the topic we'll start is speciation. Speciation is a macroevolutionary process where we've already talked about a lot of evolutionary processes that collectively are referred to as macroevolution. Macroevolution included things that affected allele frequencies. So natural selection, sexual selection, migration, mutation, genetic drift are all microevolutionary processes because they affect allele frequencies. Speciation is one of these macroevolutionary processes where we're talking about changes in the number of species on the planet. This type of change in the number of species involves the creation of new species. Okay? So speciation itself is the creation of new species. So that's what we need to talk a little bit about today. In order to start this conversation, it would probably be a good idea to define out species. What is a species specifically? We're very cavalier about using this term without really defining it. It's kind of like fitness, right? We used it a lot before we ever defined it. Like fitness, species is a very, very tough term to define. There are actually a lot of definitions out there for what a species is. So we're going to start with the one that's the most widely used definition of a species. And this definition is what's called the biological species concept, otherwise known as the BSC. It has its own acronym. So the biological species concept goes something like this. It's a group of potentially interbreeding individuals that can produce offspring together. All right. It doesn't seem like such a difficult definition to work with. The idea is you have a group of individuals, and the sheer fact that they can produce offspring together is what allows us to say that these individuals are members of the same species. Now, just because they can produce offspring doesn't mean they're going to produce offspring, right? So that's why we have this potentially in here. There are a lot of humans on the planet, and any two human, male and female, could produce offspring together, but it's a potential. They're not actually doing it. It's a potential to have offspring together. And then some people have added to this definition a little bit, and this is something that we could stick in right here. That another condition is that these offspring that they produce together have to be fertile and viable. Let me give you a quick example. Horses and donkeys can produce offspring together, and the offspring that they produce is what's called a mule. We recognize the donkey and the horse as being members of two separate species, despite the fact that they can produce offspring together, because mules are not fertile. They can't produce offspring. So because mules can't produce offspring, the offspring produced by the horse and the donkey not fertile, therefore we don't consider them to be members of the same species under the biological species concept. Okay? Now, the biological species concept works pretty well for a lot of species. That is, humans, what is a human? That would fall under the biological species concept. All members of Homo sapiens, potentially interbreeding individuals that could produce fertile, viable offspring together. We could do the same thing with rabbits, foxes, horses, chickens, chickadees, robins, cardinals. I've been seeing a few of those out on the lawn. So because of this ability to produce offspring together, they're referred to as members of the same species, right? That's what defines the species, the potential to produce these offspring together. All right, now, also on the planet are a lot of organisms that we can't use this definition for. I'm thinking about things like bacteria. Bacteria don't really have offspring in the way that we think of having offspring. Instead, we have this bacteria with its single chromosome going through a process called binary fission to produce two daughter cells. This is a form of reproduction. It's a asexual reproduction process. It's reproduction without sex. And because these individuals can reproduce in this sense, right, binary fission is a form of asexual reproduction, but it doesn't fit real well into the biological species concept. What makes E. coli different from any other species out there, like Bacillus subtilis? Right? What makes those two species different from each other? Well, E. coli can't produce offspring together. It's not like you have two E. coli and they get together and produce offspring together. It's not how it works with bacteria or any other prokaryote. And therefore, this biological species concept does not work real well with bacteria, because in order to have potentially interbreeding individuals, we have to be engaging in some sort of sexual reproduction. While organisms that don't do sexual reproduction don't fall under this definition very well. And in fact, those of you that have any microbiology experience at all know that bacteria can, in certain situations, create a structure called a pilus that can unidirectionally transfer genetic information between one bacterial cell and another. And what is being exchanged here is genetic information. There is recombination that's going on with these different pieces of DNA, and they can unidirectionally transfer genetic information to other species, in quote, of bacteria. And in that sense, they're mixing genetic information that will produce two new daughter cells that are kind of different from the original parent's composition of DNA. So for organisms that reproduce asexually, this definition doesn't work very well at all. We could even take not just the prokaryotes, but if I had a eukaryote here, for example, species of zooplankton. This is an animal-like plankton here. Well, it is an animal, I should say. It's an animal in the plankton that consumes phytoplankton or other zooplankton. There are species in Antarctica that are exclusively asexual. That is, they produce offspring through asexual reproduction. That means all the offspring that they produce are genetically identical to mom. There are no males in the population. And because the rotifers, there are different individuals that have different genotypes, all of the daughter cells produced by this original mother here have the same genotype as mom. So the biological species concept doesn't work real well here either, because the individuals are not interbreeding, And then the question is, well, what's a species? I mean, is this a distinct species compared to this one, given the fact that they're very different from each other genetically? So you can see kind of some of the confusion that would show up here is, how do we make this definition work for these types of organisms? And the answer is you really can't. You'd have to come up with some sort of other definition, maybe based on some other characteristics of organisms. And then the last one I want to share with you is, what do we do about organisms that can't reproduce because they're fossilized? I'm thinking of things like Tyrannosaurus rex here, which is a recognized species, right, the genus and the epithet. Because it's its own species, well, how did we decide that this group of fossilized organisms belong to this species, whereas another group of fossils belong to a completely different species, like the Brontosaurus or Stegosaurus? What allows us to put these into different genera? Well, we can't use the species concept here because this relies on the production of offspring. Well, they're not producing offspring, so here we have to come up with some sort of a definition based on physical traits, right? And these physical traits allow us to assign individuals to different species. In this sense, this is a very Linnaean approach, because what you're dealing with are just the traits, the external traits that organisms have. Make sense? So for us, we're going to work with this one because it's the most common, but recognize that for some organisms, that biological species concept does not work real well. Okay? All right, now, if I've got some ancestral group of individuals here, it's a group of individuals of species A, let's say. Group of individuals of species A. Now, species A somehow is going to go through some kind of a weird process in here. This is just to indicate, I don't know how much time has passed in here, but something is going to happen in here that leads to the creation of a new species. As one of the ways I could do this is to have species A become species B, or I could have something like this, where species A continues on and species B, at this point in time right here, becomes new to the planet. Okay? Both of these are speciation processes. I'm changing one species into another one, and here, under our more tight definition, the creation of species B from this ancestral species A. Here, I've increased the number of species on the planet. Here, I've kept them the same. But then the question really is, what's happening at these points in time that's allowing for this speciation process to work? In other words, what is it that's going on with speciation that really allows for the creation of this new species? Okay? All right. How does this process play out? What's the mechanism? How does speciation work? So currently we recognize two main groupings of processes that allow for the creation of new species. One is referred to as allopatric speciation, and the other one is called sympatric speciation. Okay? Now, the patric in here, think patriot, patricide, right? It refers to like father or nation or country or location. The idea here is that this is a location, and then allo is the same root word as allele. This means different, and sim means the same. So different location speciation, same location speciation. So the way that these two processes of speciation play out, one requires individuals to be in different locations. One plays out despite the fact that individuals remain in the same location. So let's start out with allopatric speciation and kind of walk our way through how we think this would play out. So let's start out here with a group of ground squirrels. Okay, and these ground squirrels exist within this very large population here. Now, running through this population is a little tiny stream. The stream is not very big, and the ground squirrels can move back and forth across this stream without any problems. This population of ground squirrels is going to exist here for tens of thousands of years, and while they're existing here, this stream is beginning to erode away this bedrock material, and as it continues to erode it away, it begins to carve its way through the rock, and over time, as it carves its way through, it eventually develops into this very large canyon that we'll call the Grand Canyon. So this is that original stream. It's cut its way down through this rock over tens of thousands of years, and at some point, we've carved away enough rock that it's no longer possible for these ground squirrels to move across the canyon. That is, we've set up some sort of a barrier here that's blocking migration. Remember, migration is one of those microevolutionary processes. The effect of migration is to homogenize populations because we're moving alleles around and they're getting mixed up in this large population. Here, I have two populations of squirrels that are left over when this barrier becomes large enough to block migration. Once the migration is blocked, I now have